Kia ora tātou. Greetings and welcome, and a special welcome to our guest speaker, Geoff Troughton. It's my great pleasure to introduce Geoff to you. He's a senior lecturer in religious studies at Victoria University, where he teaches courses in religion and politics, religion in New Zealand, and the Pacific, Christianity and secularisation. His current research focuses on missionary Christianity and peace activism in New Zealand and contemporary religious change in connection with the New Zealand Attitudes and Values Study. His major publications include The New Zealand Jesus in 2011, Spirit of the Past in 2011, which he edited with Hugh Morrison, and another publication is due to be launched by University Press this year, called Sacred Histories in Secular New Zealand. So thank you, Geoff. We look forward to hearing what you've got to say. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Warm greetings to you all. If the title for today's talk seems enigmatic or perhaps a little crude, it may be useful to start with a word of explanation, or at least an anecdote. Some months ago, I met with a number of scholars, colleagues and various other folk from outside the university, and we were discussing a concept, a nascent proposal I suppose, that aimed to strengthen the cross-disciplinary study of Christianity within the university. There was some quite exciting discussion, fledgling ideas being advanced about how we could promote the study of Christianity, focusing especially on Christianity in its social and political terms, and in relation to the various influences of Christianity on culture and ideas. That is, we were thinking about Christianity in social scientific terms as an object of inquiry rather than in specifically theological terms. Now, to most people in the room, that sounded like a really good idea, well, at least in general terms. Christianity is, after all, the world's largest religious tradition or set of traditions, accounting for the religious affiliation of fully 1/3 of the world's population. It's also a truly global religion, a significant and in many places a growing factor in culture, politics and society, including within our own Pacific region. And it remains the largest religious tradition in New Zealand. Yet the study of Christianity remains largely marginal in New Zealand, barely rating a mumble outside of theological circles and some historical ones, despite the tradition's global significance and a much vaunted return to religion in recent years within parts of the humanities and social sciences, notably in Europe but also in other places. So, if most people in the room found the prospect of more engaged study of Christianity exciting or warmed to the prospect, one person in particular sensed a flaw. The problem, they suggested, was that we were talking about the C word. That was a fundamental problem. Maybe we could talk about similar issues if we focused on philosophy or talked about ethics, but there was no way that the study of Christianity would be a winner in this day and age, especially within the university. Now, there are a bunch of things that could be said about that meeting and about that observation in particular, and maybe we can return to some of those later. But what struck me most forcefully, however, was the remarkable point that such discomfort and opprobrium could be attached to even the word Christianity. Has Christianity really become a taboo in New Zealand? And if so, how did we come to that point? Just 100 years ago, 95% of census respondents affiliated with one form or another of Christianity in New Zealand. How did Christianity go from being the religion of the people to becoming the equivalent of a coarse, boundary-pushing swear word? Well, the answers to those questions are, of course, varied and complex. And perhaps there will be an opportunity to reflect on them, the factors, a little bit later. What I wish to do here, however, is to outline one historical factor that I think has played a part in the New Zealand story. It's particularly relevant here because it relates to discourses of Christianity, and it connects to larger stories about, and debates about secularisation. While it doesn't explain everything about contemporary attitudes by any means, I want to suggest that it sheds some light on the process through which a certain hostility towards Christianity took hold in New Zealand. Now, there is a big debate about secularisation, and without going into it too much, it's worth mentioning one aspect of the debate here because it's relevant for my argument. Older classical views of secularisation tended to speak in terms of a long, slow decline of religion in the modern era. These approaches linked secularisation closely and intricately to modernisation. The more modern societies became, the less important religion became. Now, such understandings have been widely critiqued, but nevertheless it is clear that allegiance to institutional Christianity diminished greatly in the second half of the 20th century in most of Europe and in places like New Zealand. The church's social influence waned, and Christianity was also largely, if not completely, culturally displaced. In an influential reappraisal of secularisation theories in Britain, Callum Brown accepted that these big changes all occurred, but he emphasises that the change happened at a much greater speed than most people previously have allowed. Brown's study focused on the forms of piety that framed individual identities and a Christian national identity in Britain. He wrote of the death of Christian Britain as demonstrated in the sudden decline in people's adherence to discursive Christianity. That is, people's subscription to protocols of personal identity which they derive from Christian expectations or discourses. To put it another way, he looked at the shape of Christian faith as it appeared in popular culture and in public discourse prior to the 1960s, and suggested that that all collapsed quite abruptly, specifically in 1963. My claim here is that before the 1960s, the discursive Christianity that operated within New Zealand included strains that were highly critical of Christianity. Indeed, I suggest that by the early 20th century, dis-ease with organised Christianity was so common as to be a form of piety. It was a way of being Christian, a way of being devout, was to be critical and uncomfortable with organised religion. Understanding this piety helps us to better understand our history, but it may also help us to understand something of our present moment a little bit better. The particular discourse of disease that I want to consider derives from my research on representation of Jesus in early 20th century New Zealand. It's the image of Jesus as a prophetic critic of religion. In my book, New Zealand Jesus, I've argued that Protestant Christianity was reconfigured in important ways in the early 20th century. Notably, I suggest that it became more Jesus-centred. And by Jesus-centred, I mean that Christianity became much more focused on the human Jesus rather than the divine Christ, concentrating on his teaching, his example, and social relationships, especially his personality. These dimensions acquired new value as sources of religious authority. The image of Jesus as a prophetic critic of religion was an important feature of what I've called Jesus-centred religiosity. This prophetic Jesus discourse had various contours. One dimension presented Jesus as a stranger who had been widely misunderstood and misrepresented, especially by the churches. Another claimed that Jesus was fundamentally a reformist, someone who consistently challenged the status quo, particularly institutions and especially the church. In this context, the real Jesus, inverted commas, was invoked against the churches, with critics arguing that if Jesus were alive today, he would likely oppose them. Such rhetoric was invoked to address many of the church's supposed failings, yet always in ways that carefully distinguished Jesus from contemporary religion. And so I want to give you just a few examples of the use of this language that highlight the ubiquity of the image, but also the range of purposes for which that kind of language was deployed. For it was always deployed in order to bolster particular claims and agendas. The claim that Jesus was a stranger to the churches was one way of saying that the churches lacked spiritual insight, that basically they had got their founder, Jesus, wrong. As a literary device, the stranger motif was particularly evident in at least three distinct forms. One of these forms came in the shape of quasi-biographical literature that became popular in the early 20th century. Lives of Jesus of a particular type that purported to reveal the untold story of the hidden years in Jesus' life, those bits in between the gospel narratives that speak of his childhood and his later ministry. Accounts like Levi Dowling's The Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ suggested or claimed that these years were spent in India, a fact that the churches had deliberately suppressed. Assertions like that were clearly made to bolster the legitimacy of a variety of smaller, newer, esoteric religious movements. A second version of that stranger motif emphasised more strongly that Jesus embodied an authentic spirituality that could be differentiated from ecclesiastical religion. So the journalist and poet Arthur H. Adams' volume, The Nazarene, A Study of a Man, exemplified that tradition. In this extended poem, Adams claimed that the real Jesus had been overshadowed by too much emphasis on his divinity and by churchiness. Jesus' humanity had been shrouded, in Adams' words, by the waving of fine priestly hands, incense smoke, and the throb of sonorous organs. By contrast, the true Jesus, the sweet Nazarene, was a hero, a dreamer, a lover of children, a restless figure who explored the wild in tune with the divine spirit. This kind of romantic vision was also evident in a range of much more obviously devout literature, including some of the poetry of Ursula Bethel. A third literary version of the stranger motif focused on Jesus as a marginalised, misunderstood, and ultimately victimised figure. And here R.A.K. Mason's poem On the Swag provides an example of this type. Mason's Jesus here is ostracised because he is not recognised. He's victimised because society fails to see his true identity. The idea that Jesus was an unrecognised stranger sometimes shaded into more confrontational claims of outright hostility between Jesus and the churches. And in this approach, Jesus was enlisted in more direct complaints against institutional religion. critics accused the churches of misrepresenting Jesus and cultivating religious systems that were entirely at odds with Jesus' actual teaching. Contemporary church leaders were cast as Jesus' historical persecutors. They were the Pharisees, and in turn, Jesus opposed them. That kind of more confrontational, argumentative language was particularly evident in discourses of socialism, which had become the leading ideological framework for the labour movement's attempts to improve social conditions from the 1890s. I've pieced together lots and lots of examples of this kind of language within the socialist world. It's there in the milder forms of state socialism, of Fabianism, but also in the much more confrontational, revolutionary forms of socialism of the early 19th century. So a few examples of this will give something of the flavour. In 1890, Arthur Desmond produced one of the earliest New Zealand studies of Jesus as a social reformer. His influential pamphlet argued that the opponents of Jesus included heads of the church, the owners of land, the owners of slaves, and the owners of capital. In more recent times, Jesus' opponents included theologians who had suppressed the social element of Jesus' teaching, and clergy who betrayed him through their theology, gold greed, and personal aggrandisement. Desmond preached the Christianity of Christ, which consisted of social equality and duty towards one's fellow man. The churches had degraded this message through dogma, denominationalism, bigotry and creed, belief and ceremony. Actually, Desmond's pamphlet was plagiarised. He'd ripped it off from somebody else. But the basic points that he was making were taken up in many subsequent volumes. Key ideas that Desmond put forward became stock arguments within socialist literature over the following decades. Notably, those ideas included the notion of a gulf between the Christianity of Christ and the religion of the churches, and the charge that contemporary Christianity had become enslaved to wealth and neglectful of Jesus' ethical teaching. One long-standing method of attacking institutional Christianity focused on a distinction between real Christianity and priestcraft, or in the more contemporary language of the time, of churchianity, the distinction between Christianity and churchianity. Labour and socialist appeals to Jesus in these terms constituted one part of a wider argument concerning the failure of social institutions. And so, in this sense, the image of Jesus with his whip of cords going into the temple and disrupting the temple became key symbols of opposition to established authority, including the established authority of religion. Numerous pieces in the Labour newspaper, the Māoriland Worker, cast Jesus as a critic of church practices and of leaders of conventional religion. As one argued, Jesus confounded the self-righteous and made light of formal religion. He mocked the orthodox of his day. To him, creeds, churches, systems, sacraments and ceremonies were nothing. Another writer to the Māoriland Worker argued that hardly a claim made in the name of Christ today by the churches that take his name in vain but can be refuted out of his own mouth. R.S. Mackay claimed that many socialists deny Christ with their lips but accept him by their lives, ideals and sacrifice. If I think that Christ himself were here today, he would undoubtedly cast his lot in with the socialists as being those who carry on his work. Now, examples of this type abound. There are many, many examples of this kind of language. And it's possible to make that kind of language sound like, or that kind of critique of the churches, sound like an attack on organised Christianity by the forces of irreligion. Certainly some of these motifs were deployed in this way to undermine the churches. However, I think it actually makes a lot more sense of the language to see it as a form of piety, not least because it was also very widely employed in a wide range of explicitly pro-religious agendas. Recovery of the real Jesus and the Christianity of Jesus was seen within religious organisations and religious movements as a means of reinvigorating contemporary religion. What was needed was Christianity, not churchianity or religion. Again, different versions of this language appeared, advancing a host of often quite contradictory agendas. For example, evangelicals and revivalists castigated themselves for presenting a churchianity to the world rather than the true Christianity of Jesus, thus obfuscating the true essence of the Christian message. Populist Auckland city missioners Colin Scrimgeour and Jasper Calder differentiated Jesus from conventional religiosity as they sought to promote a church without creed, something that was built in the human heart, something that required of its members no doctrine other than that of love and kindness. Scrimgeour in particular reiterated that the strong, happy, healthy Jesus had been hidden for nearly 2,000 years beneath the dark cloak of orthodoxy and almost buried in the tomb of man-made creeds. Early Pentecostals used similar language, repudiating the dry rot of churchianity. But remarkably, so too did modernist theologians such as H.D.A. Major, who sought to bring the church up to date by rethinking the dogmatic and institutional foundations of the faith. Major claimed that church leaders were impediments to progress, likening them to Pharisees. He called for a return to the Christianity of Christ, not the Christianity of the great church councils, not the Christianity of the medieval scholastics, not the Christianity of the Lutheran and Calvinist Reformation, but the Christianity of Christ. The kinds of examples that I'm giving here could be replicated ad nauseum and extended to include the language of social Christians, Christian socialists, ecumenists, and liturgically oriented healing ministry advocates, amongst others. So what did that all mean, and what am I trying to make of it? Why is it relevant to how I opened? Well, I want to suggest that though there were some strikingly anti-religious expressions of the prophetic Jesus discourse, the language was typically less concerned with the abandonment of religion than its transformation. Despite its confrontational tone, hostility was a less significant theme than renewal. Jesus, the anti-church prophet, was invoked primarily in pursuit of a better way of being Christian. And so in a curious way, all this language of criticism of the church, of assault on the churches, really tends to support Toby Harper's contention that New Zealand, before the Second World War at least, was at heart still a Christian nation. As Harper explains, the churches were assumed to be integral to society and part of the nation's future. There was debate about how Christianity might be applied to solving the problems of the modern world, but Christianity itself remained at the centre of New Zealand culture and part of most people's vision of what a liberal, progressive society would look like. Viewed in this light, I'm suggesting that anti-church language is generally best seen in the first half of the 20th century as an expression of Christian identity. Jesus could be invoked with particular rhetorical force against the church, but hostility to certain ideas and practices did not necessarily entail wholesale repudiation of Christianity or even the church itself. It was a form of reformist self-critique. This claim clearly has implications in terms of the debate about secularisation and the nature and role of Christian discourse in secularisation processes. According to the Callum Brown argument, in Britain from the 1960s, a suspicion of creeds arose that quickly took the form of a rejection of Christian tradition and all formulaic constructions of the individual. Part of my argument is that this suspicion actually was much older. It didn't arise in the 1960s, but had been integral to much of the discursive Christianity of New Zealand since at least the beginning of the 20th century. If cultural displacement of Christianity occurred, it therefore occurred as a consequence of both longer-term and shorter-term processes. Any sudden collapse of Christianity in Britain and arguably in New Zealand, any sudden collapse from the 1960s was partly an outworking of an older Christian self-critique. More than this, I think, and here I'm getting into slightly more dodgy territory, I suspect, but I think, I'm going to argue, and you can debate me about it, that the rise of anti-church prophetic discourse in the early 20th century also has something to tell us about the creation of Christianity as the C word in the later 20th century, and the shift from churchianity to Christianity as the term of cultural opprobrium. If anti-church discourse was a form of piety, in the longer term, part of its significance lay in the fostering of a conviction that religious identity could be divorced from traditional religious community and ritual. As a form of piety, it effectively countenanced much lower attachment to the key institutions charged with nurturing and sustaining Christian faith and identity. Wholesale criticism from many vantage points effectively undermined the standing of the churches, which had implications for the cultural position of Christianity and transmission of the faith, not least because it authorised individualised forms of Christianity to a new degree. The individualisation of belief, eclectic faith, individualised belief, is often interpreted as being one of the hallmarks of postmodern spirituality. Yet this was also one of the issues at stake in the early debate about churchianity versus Christianity. As one writer in the 1920s argued, the claim that I believe in Christianity but not churchianity is as fallacious as believing in healings but not hospitals, or education but not colleges. Christianity, this author argued, needed institutional form. Evidently, other Christians imagined otherwise, believing that true Christianity could be expressed independently from the churches. And in fact, this sentiment was essential to the spirit of the applied practical Christianity that shaped so much of popular Christianity in New Zealand in the 20th century. The kind of Uncle Scrim, Jasper Calder type practical Christianity as brotherhood and goodwill. The difficulty, as sociologist Steve Bruce has noted, is that shorn from institutional life, popular Christianity inevitably becomes increasingly unrecognisable as Christian. As he says, without an institutional core, a popular religious culture cannot be sustained. To conclude, I want to suggest that, or affirm that a variety of factors propelled the de-churching of New Zealand society in the later 20th century. In this context, it could be argued that criticism and suspicion of the churches remains as one of the key echoes of older forms of discursive Christianity in New Zealand. The churches have now become religion, and the internal critique has been configured so that Christianity, not churchianity, is now the C word. Thank you.